What happened was that in October 2015, I read an article in the Guardian newspaper by Professor Vereen Shepherd, professor of the University of the West Indies, who took the opportunity of David Cameron visiting Jamaica to say, "Yes, Mr. Cameron, you owe us." This refers to the fact that when the slave trade was abolished, all the rich people in England who owned slaves were compensated financially, but the slaves weren't. She referred to the only white man who's ever done the right thing by freed slaves as David Barclay. So my eyes popped out and I thought, oh, I've never seen anything about him in print. And I read on and she said, and I'm in touch with the descendant of one of the people that he freed, so I know the effects lasted and were good. I've always thought if I was a researcher, I would try and find out what happened to these people with their new life. Did it work? Did they survive in cold Philadelphia? What was it like? Well, now, by an astonishing turn of events, I'm in touch with October's great-great-grandson. And we're going to meet on the pen in Jamaica. Very strange, the whole prospect of meeting this chap. The fact is, I'm going to meet somebody who wouldn't exist if an ancestor of mine hadn't moved his great-great-grandfather from Jamaica to Philadelphia, where he prospered, where he married, where he had children, and hence Keith. That has to be, to say the least, unusual. In the late 18th century, a man called David Barclay, who was one of the founders of Barclays Bank, was a very rich merchant and Quaker. As a result of a business debt, he and his brother acquired a pen in Jamaica.
So here it is, Unity Valley Pen, March 1784. Yes.
That's the date when John...
Absolutely. Now in possession of Messrs. David and John Barclay of London, the mortgagees. There you go. Jamaica had several types of properties, including sugar plantations, but we're talking about a livestock farm or pen.
Ah,
yes.
I've often got that muddled, because I've carelessly called it a plantation, but it's not a plantation.
No.
It's a pen.
It's a pen, and it's really like a ranch or a... but the British call them pens. More animals than crops, yes.
Okay. So the cattle and the slaves were just objects that they acquired.
They are all grouped together as property. They have acquired with enslaved people on the property.
Now, being a Quaker, the idea of owning slaves on this plantation was abhorrent to him. Absolutely against all his principles of Quaker faith that there's God in everybody, and so how can one human being own another human being? So he set about trying to do something about it. And in short, he took these people from the pen to Philadelphia under the care of a philanthropic society there, put them into households where they were educated, taught a trade, set up with money, and given the name Barclay because they only had single names as slaves and they needed more as they went into the world. This descendant, whose name is Keith Stokes, it would be very poetic if he were Keith Barclay. His mother was a Barclay. To meet him face to face will be really extraordinary.
David Barclay made the decision to not only emancipate them, but he had a plan for reparations. So his goal was not to simply free them, but to give them a free life. That is very rare in the history of African diaspora across the Western Hemisphere. And to have that on a very personal level helps me connect the dots of why my great-grandfather did well, my grandfather did well. They passed on this very rare opportunity to live free and to build their own life and prosperity well before many other people of color could even dream of that. My hope for this, and what I feel on a very personal level, is this is not a historical ghost of the past. This is a flesh and blood little boy that somehow made it, persevered, because of not the generosity, but because of the strategic interest in David Barclay in doing something human in the 18th century, which unfortunately we still wrestle with to this very day. Young October was given a very special opportunity to persevere much earlier than many of the other people of his race and ethnicity. I'm embarrassed that I hadn't been here before. I mean, as a public scholar, I have done African American and African history programs in a number of the Caribbean countries, and not to be in Jamaica. So I'm happy to be back in my ancestral roots. I cannot wait to go to Unity Pen, to actually physically be at a place that's connected to my ancestor. I couldn't even explain what the emotions might be. Well, I'm very excited to meet Humphrey, and his life and my life, even though separated, we seem to have both been very connected to not only our family history, but giving back to the community. So maybe this was to be. I mean, maybe both of us are channeling our, Barclay ancestors to this day. So to me, it'll be like probably a reunion, like an old friend.
I used to be rather embarrassed by the fact that they were taken from Jamaica and sent to Philadelphia with labels around their necks. It sort of felt almost proprietorial to me, It felt like exactly the ownership that David was trying to rid himself of. But actually, Keith said, oh, you couldn't be more wrong, because I raised it with him. He said, you couldn't be more wrong. We have always been so proud to wear that name. So his family, and to actually have the privilege of meeting on the spot where life changed for October Robert Barclay. And that I should be there, it's just really very, very extraordinary. Looking at this landscape, time disappears, and it's very easy to suddenly people this landscape with those what we know about. October at 8 probably had only just started to work, but no doubt he'd be shepherding the cattle and taking them down to the water every day, coming from their houses over there. Really quite a pleasant life, if it weren't for the fact that they were not free. It's not at all the image that one has of plantations with the fearful backbreaking, cutting of sugarcane and all that you've got planted in your head. This was another aspect of slavery. The living circumstances seemed to be more pleasant, but however pleasant they were, they depended on a fact that David couldn't contemplate. They were objects that he owned, and that, for him as a Quaker, was intolerable. And having done what he could do, he hoped it would be an example to others, not only to right a wrong, but also to prove to the world the worth of these fellow human beings who had been subjugated by their terrible treatment in Africa and since. It was an act of extraordinary humanity. Who would have thought that 221 years later, we could knit these pieces together again?
Must be Humphrey. Good to see you. Good to see you. This is great. What do you feel like? What are you feeling?
a bit overwhelmed.
You know, they
I
asked me,
picked a flower from your land.
you know, they asked me what my first feeling was here, and I said I felt like a survivor. As beautiful as this place is, I still have to think of all the people who survived and didn't survive. But what David Barclay did, I thank you on behalf of October, because what he did, compared to any other European, American, French, Spanish, Dutch, anyone who owned slaves, he not only freed them, he gave them a free life.
Well, aren't we lucky to be here to celebrate it?
People thought this is insane, why do this? You disrupt the system, you disrupt the money. Even good Quakers would have supported emancipation, but no one would have supported a life of freedom and investment. That's the difference.
It's documented that they were going to be educated and they were going to be taught a trade and all this, but actually, of course, they had to be taught freedom. They had to be taught there is another life.
And who did they interact with? Free Africans.
People like them who hadn't been brought up as slaves.
Yes.
And so they could see the world and the chance that there was ahead.
That level of far-reaching thinking is unprecedented. Unfortunately, the majority of people who look like me or my kids aren't doing well. And the only difference is that we had a head start. We had a head start. My grandparents went to college. I mean, my great-grandparents went to college, owned property, paid taxes. I mean, their greatest worry in the 1860s and 1880s was pay the next bill, go on with your life. Whereas most other people's next worries were their lives.
He hoped that his example would teach other people that these fellow human beings were capable of life on equal terms if only they were thought of as brothers.
So here you are, and in my view, you came to Jamaica in search of something. What did you find?
To be here, I can't explain the experience. It's both exciting, but it also, I feel, as I've said before, is kind of a survivor. I mean, what David Barclay did, which was reparations for the 18th century, provided those African Jamaicans a jump start or a head start that unfortunately most others didn't have.
David never saw the people that he did this for. He adopted them by the use of the family name, and he didn't have any sons himself, so here's a member of the family.
Your ideas before you left and your ideas when you arrived.
In America, we have a saying, and it's called sold down the river. And what it meant in the 18th century was better to be a New England house servant than to be sold and further south into a tobacco plantation in Virginia colony. But the worst circumstance was to be in a sugar plantation in the West Indies. So the further south you went, the worse your circumstance. So when I've always thought of Jamaica, I wasn't thinking of a grazing pen. What always came to mind was the brutality and the voluminous work and enslavement within these sugarcane plantations.
I have here something I'd like to show you. This is the seal. Of the Anti-Slavery Society. And it was like the logo that the whole Society for Abolition of Slave Trade used. They would all stamp their letters with this seal. And it has the kneeling figure of an African in chains, supplicating position, and round the top it says, "Am I not a man and a brother?" David handled that.
Wow.
For someone who has used this image and seen this image since my college days, to actually see the actual authentic stamp, I mean, this is like having gold history in your hand.
And inside this bag, which is a jolly bag that comes from Ghana, is something that I give you with great respect.
Yes, Sonny, come on.
It's a copy of the great Quaker work, The Apology, which was written by David's grandfather. And this is a copy which David had bound specially to give to his nephew.
Oh, look at this. Look at this, look at this.
One day in June 1795, William Holden collected them all up and said, "We're off on our big adventure," and took them to the harbour in Kingston to get on the ship that he'd arranged. And they refused to get on the ship. an incredibly dramatic moment. And he said he went through agonies that afternoon because he was about to fail in his mission. Why wouldn't they get on? Well, there was a rumor, had gone round like wildfire, that they were going to be sold to the Spaniards.
Many of the adults were African-born. So for them, coming back to the waterfront from the pen and seeing ships, and potentially seeing ships that are bringing in fresh Africans, I think it's fear. I think it's a fear of, where are we going? I mean, for us today, a sailing vessel is something that we see as is serene and as historic, but I think for them it is sheer horror. And I think for October at 8, and some of the younger children, I mean, it would have been probably a combination of wonderment, but also fear. It would have been overwhelming to me if I could put myself back into my ancestors' shoes.
And indeed, our people were scared and decided they wouldn't go.
And I think that decision not to go is possibly the concern of being slaves again. I think the older Africans would have said, the last time I saw a ship, I was being placed in a hold in chains. That's my experience of a ship. And now you're bringing me back to a ship. And you're telling me something of freedom. What's freedom? I haven't known that. Am I returning to Africa? Where are you? What's a Philadelphia? I mean, what a great unknown for them.
Eventually, one of them was persuaded, and he persuaded the others that actually this was okay. And they got on the ship, and they became very good friends, all of them, and they went to Philadelphia. And October, we know, was apprenticed to a Windsor chair maker.
It's the beginning of me. It's a beginning of an entirely new African heritage person that the Atlantic world had not seen, a free one. And here's this 8-year-old boy that steps off this dock, never to return until today, but his life and the life of his descendants is a prosperous one, and that's powerful.
Well, you know, thinking how David would react to our conversation, the Shakespeare lines come to me. The evil that men do lives after them. The good is oft interred with their bones. In this case, it wasn't.
October represented a journey to black freedom.
He made a living as a free man. He could have gone under. He could have lost the battle. It was so strange, but he didn't. He must have been a fighter.
You know, what David Barclay did was unique in the annals of the Atlantic slave trade. And that's why I really believe he created that guidebook and distributed it, and he tried to get it out widely, because if we read it and we read it again and again, it guides people, it gives people an opportunity. You can follow this path.
Well, now that you mention that, calling it a guidebook, I never thought of it that way. I think of it as what he called it, an account. But you're saying it's almost an instruction manual.
He did something that very few before him, during his time, and even to this day, have done. He recognized the humanity in a people. He set aside race, ethnicity, religion, class, and he said, these are human beings, and they deserve a right to live life free as human beings. And I would thank him for being such a unique human being in his own right. And I would thank him for that guidebook that he created. And maybe it's our obligation to redistribute that guidebook across the world again.
My mother called him Teapot Face. That's all we knew about him. And it was with some astonishment later on that I realized this is the man this extraordinary story is all about. He lives with me. I've got him on my wall. I feel an extraordinary affection for him, a bond with him, admiration, and obligation to let people know that in this world, one man thought, what can I do?